Well, as you might be able to tell from the camera, we're recording today, and it's episode 5.2 of the Eucharistic Revival series I'm giving on the Holy Eucharist. For those who were here yesterday, you get a repeat, so bear with me. We're dealing with the effects of the sacrament of the Eucharist. And version 5.1, which you recorded just previously this month, we talked about whether grace is bestowed in the sacrament of the Eucharist, and it's yes, obviously. We did talk a little bit at the end, as a little tie-in, the objection whether attaining of glory is an effect of this sacrament, the glory of heaven. And the objection was, well, to say it briefly, if it attains to glory, how come when the Eucharist we don't attain to glory immediately, right? The effect should proceed from the cause proportionately. As I've kind of stated to the religious sisters when I have Mass on Sunday or here, when you don't come up for communion, I give you the Holy Eucharist and poof, you disappear because you're suddenly in heaven, right? The Eucharist does not work that way. And when St. Thomas responds to this objection, he says, as Christ's passion, on Calvary, in virtue whereof the sacrament is accomplished, is indeed a sufficient cause of glory, yet not whereby we are immediately admitted into glory, but that we must first suffer with him in order that we may be glorified afterwards. And he says, so is the Eucharist. So that question, that objection can be brought back to, well, if Christ died at Calvary, why didn't everybody just automatically zip up to heaven who believed in him, right? Well, it's the same effect from Calvary, is the same effect with the Eucharist. It attains to glory as wayfarers, and then we suffer with him and are configured to him in order to eventually achieve glory. And Thomas brings up from 3 Kings, in the Old Testament, Elijah, who is despondent with all of Israel's kings being against him and all the false prophets against him. And he sleeps under a tree. And then he's urged, I believe, by an angel of God to awake, eat and drink, and in that strength of that food to journey 40 days and nights to Mount Horeb, the Mount of God. Thomas uses that. So that is the idea of the Eucharist. It's food for the journey, right, to get you to the glory of heaven. So faith gives way to vision, hope gives way to possession, but charity will be the same in heaven. Charity we have here will affect the amount of glory we have in heaven. It's a great motivation to be charitable. That will determine where we are in heaven. So charity we have now is identical with and in continuity with the charity we'll have in heaven, with the plenary possession of the vision of God. The Eucharist sustains us in this charity, helps us grow in charity as we share in the suffering of Christ and our soul is purified for the resurrection of the body. And that gets us a little segue. We'll be covering this in the next months about the sacrifice of the Mass. We've covered transubstantiation and now the effects of receiving the Eucharist. And eventually we'll get to the sacrifice of Mass. But a couple of practical questions that come up. Whether the forgiveness of mortal sin is an effect of this sacrament, say of receiving Holy Communion. And the answer is not really. There's other ways that can be affected, but the sacrament of confession obviously is the way to achieve absolution from any mortal sin. Venial sins are forgiven in taking the Eucharist, since venial sins wound the heart but don't destroy charity, which mortal sins do. And so venial sins can be healed or restored by the reception of Holy Communion. That's encouraging for us. Venial sins pile on us pretty quickly, right, in our daily lives. Another question, whether the entire punishment due to sin is forgiven by the sacrament. With sin, we must distinguish the guilt from the punishment, right? So we were talking about forgiveness of venial sins, that would be the guilt of it. But what about the punishment? And Thomas says, by way of receiving Holy Communion, punishment for sin is forgiven through a kind of, that big word again, as I said yesterday, concomitance, related to union as an effect of charity, the fervor of which man obtains forgiveness not only of guilt, but also of punishment for sin. This forgiveness is not indeed for the entire punishment, but according to the person's devotion and fervor. can shorten purgatory and reorient negative instincts from venial sin. I call that reason number 981,673 for approaching the Mass with devotion, because the measure of your devotion will determine, as an effect of that union with Christ in the Eucharist and charity, your level of devotion will determine the amount of that punishment that will be forgiven. It is measured by your participation. So the Mass is both a sacrifice and a sacrament. It is in the nature of a sacrifice to the extent it is offered up to God the Father, the Eucharist offered up, and is in the nature of a sacrament to the extent it is received by you at Holy Communion. So let's look at a couple of items. You can't receive physical communion at Mass, or even a spiritual communion, unless you're in the state of grace. You can't receive it worthily unless you're in the state of grace. You would not receive grace from the sacrament if you're not in the state of grace when you physically receive or spiritual communion. You can't receive Holy Communion for someone else's benefit, right? You can't say, I'm going to go today and receive Holy Communion for you, my sister. You don't receive Holy Communion for other people. The grace is for you. But when you attend Mass, you also assist at the offering of the sacrifice of the Mass. You assist Christ on the altar, who is offering himself to God the Father. You are taking your life and saying, I am now offering it with you, God the Son, to God the Father. That is the primary purpose of Mass. It is not the primary purpose of Mass to receive Holy Communion, as evidenced by the fact that if you're sick, we can bring you Holy Communion. You don't have to be at Mass. It is a good thing, it is a very extremely worthy thing to receive Holy Communion. Primary purpose of Mass is to offer yourself to God the Father through God the Son. That's what preparation for Mass is really about, right? Fully offering yourself, completely, all your sufferings, all your joys, your whole life, through God the Son, who is at that same time offering himself completely to God the Father. So that's the purpose. Eucharistic adoration, right? I think we know this, but this is not the sacrifice of the Mass. And you can commune with the real presence of Christ in charity at adoration. In short, Eucharistic adoration is simply prolonged spiritual communion. That's what it is. And it can have a great benefit in our spiritual life because of that psychological effect of being with the Lord for so long and gazing on him. You would need to be in the state of grace in order to receive the benefits of that spiritual communion. I call it my personal view. I never looked into it, but I don't think by television one can actually engage in spiritual communion and Eucharistic adoration. There's no doubt it's devotional and it can be of blessing, but I think there's a requirement of moral presence in front of the Eucharist in order to engage in proper spiritual communion. Somebody might debate that, but that would be my view. Proper spiritual communion. So, insofar as one participates in the sacrifice of the Mass has satisfactory or atoning power for sins. Yet in atonement, the affection of the offerer is weighed rather than the quantity of the offering. So St. Thomas gives the example of the widow's mite, where she gave everything. Right? So the sacrifice has the quantity to satisfy all punishment, the power of the Eucharist, and in its sacrifice, in it is the whole Paschal mystery, the whole crucifixion and resurrection. But it becomes satisfactory for a person for whom it is offered, or even for the offerers, according to the measure of their devotion. That's reason 986,897. To have devotion, because the measure of your devotion in offering yourself up with God the Son to God the Father determines the benefit of that atoning power for sins. And that participation, the sacrifice, can be offered, you can offer from your pew, assisting at Mass, offering your life, can be offered for somebody else. So that's the way to prepare for Mass, is most about that assisting in God the Son's sacrifice to God the Father. So as we celebrate the Eucharist today, when I describe it that way, coming to Mass is a lot of work. You really got to prepare. It is, when we talk about Vatican II, full active and conscious participation, right? That doesn't mean I get as many of you up into the sanctuary to do little jobs for me so you can have full active and conscious participation. Full active and conscious participation is you offering your life in sacrifice to God the Father through God the Son. And that takes a lot of work, and everybody can do it. So as we celebrate the Eucharist, we ask our Lord to give us that motivation to offer our lives.